A black bitch thinking she knows the law? Lieutenant Halver barked like a wounded beast, furious that a black woman dared to speak up in court. No warrant, no warning, no hesitation. He charged like a rabid dog, slammed her to the ground, and punched her straight in the face in front of the judge, the jury, and a courtroom full of cowards. The room went silent, not out of shock, but out of habit, because in America, skin color still writes your sentence. But this time, he hit the wrong target, not a civilian, but a CIA operative who once led top-secret counterintelligence missions, a storm in human form, trained to never flinch. If you were in that courtroom, would you bow your head, or rise, and become the fire that burns injustice to the ground? The door opened without ceremony, not a knock, not a pause, just the hollow thud of rubber soles on linoleum and the quiet creak of aged hinges giving way like a throat swallowing something bitter. Lieutenant Halver strode in as if he'd been expected, as if the room owed him acknowledgement. His shoulders were squared, spine loose, arms swinging a little too freely. His uniform shirt hung open at the collar, the brass buttons gleaming but unused, left to dangle like promises he didn't intend to keep. The courtroom, designed for decorum, folded in around his presence as if it recognized a force not of law, but of habit, a man used to getting his way. He didn't glance around the room to find his place. He already knew it. Instead, his eyes cut diagonally across the chamber, catching the figure seated alone at the defense table. No cuffs, no companions, no expression. The woman looked back without blinking, without flinching, without so much as a nod of acknowledgement. Halver's lip twitched, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the kind of twitch that usually precedes something mean. He leaned slightly toward the court recorder and spoke low, but not so low that it couldn't be heard. Another black one crying wolf, huh? His tone carried the oily confidence of a man who believed microphones only worked in one direction. No one laughed. No one needed to. The message wasn't for amusement, it was an assertion, a placement of weight on the scale before the first word had been spoken under oath. Halver turned and made his way to the stand, his boot heels striking the wood like punctuation. When he sat, the bench creaked beneath him, and he let out a long, slow exhale through his nose, as though already tired of the performance he was about to give. The judge, an older man whose robes looked tailored but tired, gave the signal to proceed. Halver clasped his hands on the edge of the witness stand, leaned in, and scanned the room once more. His eyes passed over Reagan like a man dismissing a chair. Then, he began. Well, I was on patrol in Sector 6B, near the West Transit exit. It was around 0200 hours, and the suspect paused, tapping the stand lightly with a forefinger. Miss Reagan over there was loitering near the entrance. Hood up, head low. I approached and asked for ID. She ignored me. Standard defiance. He stopped, letting that phrase soak into the air. His jaw tilted, one side rising in a half smirk, so I repeated the request. That's when let's just say, things escalated. She moved aggressively. Evasive behavior. Honestly, the whole thing reminded me of one of those zoo videos, primates throwing tantrums behind glass. A beat passed. The words lingered like smoke. Halver didn't flinch. He chuckled instead, a dry, tight sound, almost rehearsed. Sorry, Your Honor, just calling it how I saw it. I followed the procedure. De-escalation. Verbal commands. She was non-compliant. I responded accordingly. His hands spread, palms up, a mock display of surrender. I didn't enjoy it, if that's what anyone's wondering. It's not like I wake up hoping for that kind of confrontation, but we're trained to assess threat levels. And trust me, when someone's got that look in their eyes, the I don't have to answer you look, well, that's usually a sign you'd better stay sharp. Reagan hadn't moved. Not even a breath too sharp, not a blink too sudden. But her hands, once folded in her lap, slowly shifted. Deliberately, one by one, her fingers pulled at the thin gold band around her ring finger. The movement was silent, small, and wholly unnoticed by the bailiffs, but to Halver, he saw it, and he paused. The ring came off with no ceremony. She set it down on the table beside her, not dropped, not tossed, just placed. Then, with the same slow rhythm, she rolled up the sleeves of her white blouse. Once, twice, no more than that. The fabric gathered at her elbows, revealing arms lean, lined, and quiet, until the light caught a pale seam that sliced across the skin from wrist to forearm. The scar was not fresh, not proud, but there. It did not speak loudly, but it did not whisper either. It simply existed, unmistakably. Reagan didn't speak. She didn't gesture. She just sat, arms exposed, ring removed, posture calm. Her eyes hadn't dropped from Halver once since he entered, not even now. The room, already tense, shifted imperceptibly, the kind of shift only sensitive instruments register: a slight loss of pressure, a flicker in a fluorescent tube, the hairs on the back of a neck raising without consent. Something had just changed, but no one could name it yet. Halver cleared his throat. "If I may continue," he said, this time not looking at the judge, but at Reagan. The air felt heavier than it had a moment ago, and his smirk, though still intact now, sat slightly wrong on his face, like a shirt buttoned one loop off. The judge nodded. The court recorder adjusted her headphones. Somewhere in the back, someone stifled a cough, but the energy had already curdled. What had started as a routine testimony had grown teeth, not by drama, not by protest, but by presence, by the unbearable weight of someone who refused to cower, refused to break eye contact, refused to validate the performance unfolding before her with any expression at all. It wasn't what Halver said, it was how freely he said it, how familiar the rhythm was, like telling an old joke to an old friend, like explaining away a bruise on someone else's body with just enough authority that people stop asking questions. But now, the eyes in the room had somewhere else to look. At the scar. The ring was removed. At the sleeves rolled up, not as a threat, but as a statement. Reagan didn't flinch. She didn't need to, because this wasn't his courtroom. Not anymore. The silence wasn't peace, it was pressure. Every breath in the courtroom felt like it had to pass through barbed wire, tight in the chest, sharp on the exit. Reagan hadn't moved since rolling up her sleeves. She didn't have to. Her presence had tilted the atmosphere, and it lingered like the scent of ozone before lightning strikes. She sat there, scar exposed, ring set aside, gaze fixed with the quiet weight of something ancient and unyielding. And it was that gaze, unwavering and indifferent, that began to chip at Lieutenant Halver's composure like acid on steel. At first, he tried to ignore it. He adjusted his posture on the stand, cleared his throat again, and looked to the judge as if inviting him to wrap things up. But his words no longer came as easily. He could feel it, that stare. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't angry. It was worse. It was unimpressed, unafraid, untouched by the performance he'd delivered, and somehow already beyond it. The judge, sensing the air turning strange, leaned forward. "Lieutenant Halver," he said carefully, "this is a court of law. Remain within the scope of testimony." The warning was formal, gentle. It wasn't meant to provoke. But Halver's jaw locked for a second too long, and when he looked back at Reagan, something in his face changed. The smirk that had floated on his lips earlier twisted tighter, uglier. He stood. It wasn't a burst. It wasn't a scene from television, with shouting or chairs toppling. It was worse. He stepped down from the stand like a man descending from a pulpit, every inch of movement declaring that he didn't care about protocol, decorum, or consequence. One step, then another. No one stopped him, not because they agreed, but because no one believed he would dare. Not here, not in court, not in front of cameras and oaths and truth, but he dared. Regan didn't flinch. Her shoulders remained squared, her hands still resting calmly on the table before her. She watched him with that same detached interest, like she was reading a file she'd seen too many times before. Halver closed the distance with the confidence of a man whose violence had been tolerated for far too long. His voice, when he finally spoke again, came low and venomous, just loud enough to scrape against the courtroom silence. "Law?" he hissed. "Around here, I am the goddamn law." The words landed with a thud no gavel could match. And then, his left hand moved. Fast, but not wild. Not an explosion. Not rage. It was worse. It was practiced. Intentional. A slow, coiled strike, honed through years of unchecked aggression masquerading as authority. His fist connected with Reagan's jaw, sharp and sudden, the impact echoing through the room like a gunshot with no bullet, just force, pure and punishing. Her head jerked to the side, the tendons in her neck stretching taut, her body absorbing the full violence of that systemic punchon honed by bias, shaped by entitlement, and delivered not as an act of anger but as a verdict. But Regan didn't fall. The courtroom inhaled, collectively and involuntarily, then froze. No one moved. No one screamed. No one rose from their seats. It was the kind of silence that didn't ask for order because it was born of disbelief. Halver's fist hung in the air for half a second longer, suspended in the echo of what he'd just done, before dropping to his side. He expected something. Recoil, collapse, even fear. But Regan was still there. Still seated, still watching. Blood welled at the corner of her mouth, slow and stark against her skin, a vivid red trailing down the line of her chin. She didn't wipe it away. She didn't break her posture. The only thing that shifted was the angle of her head, returning to face him again, like nothing had changed, like the punch had failed to register. And that was what cracked the room open. It wasn't the sound of violence that hit hardest, it was the silence after, the recognition. In the judge's widening eyes, in the bailiff's hand, frozen halfway to his holster, in the reporter whose fingers hovered, useless, above the keys of her laptop. This wasn't a man hitting a woman. This wasn't about power in the moment. This was power unmasked. This was a system bare-knuckled and brash, swinging at what it couldn't intimidate. Halver's breath caught. For the first time, he looked unsure. Not sorry, never that, but disoriented. Because something about this didn't play out the way it always had. There had been no flinch, no cry, no submission. He had thrown his worst, and it had landed, and still, she was looking at him like she'd seen it before, like it bored her. Behind them, the courtroom remained locked in mute paralysis. Eyes moved, but bodies didn't. The gallery wasn't scared. It was stunned. There was no narrative they could cling to here. No easy division of fault or righteousness. There was just a woman who had taken a punch from the law and had not budged, and a man who had delivered it like he'd done it before. Regan tilted her head, just slightly, not dramatic, not taunting, just enough to make it clear she was still in control of her spine, of her breath, of her position. Her eyes stayed on him, not burning with fury, not narrowed in judgment, just steady, still. The kind of steady that makes people check their balance. Halver took a step back. It wasn't a retreat, not yet, but there was doubt. Doubt of a kind he hadn't felt in uniform. Doubt that came not from fear of consequence, but fear of revelation, some primal recognition that the game had changed and he didn't know the new rules, or worse, that he never really knew them at all. The judge's gavel finally came down not to command, but to reclaim some semblance of process. "Lieutenant Halver," he barked, but his voice lacked the bite of authority. "You are out of order." The words felt hollow, too late, draped over the wreckage like a sheet over a crime scene. But Halver didn't respond. He was still staring at Regan, and for the first time, the smirk was gone, replaced by a twitch in the corner of his mouth, a micro-expression of something between confusion and unease. He had hit her, hard, with the full force of his training, his history, and his disdain, and she was still sitting there, whole, unshaken, and somehow heavier than before. The courtroom didn't breathe. It waited, and she didn't move. The moment didn't end with the silence, it deepened. The punch had landed, flesh against flesh, bone against pride, but Regan didn't move like people expected her to. She didn't sway like the victim of an unexpected blow, didn't clutch her jaw or gasp in pain. Instead, she absorbed the impact like the earth takes thunder, still, but forever changed beneath the surface. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth, a single line descending the edge of her chin, as precise as a drawn sword. She didn't wipe it, she didn't acknowledge it. The room watched, waiting for a reaction that never came. But the stillness wasn't peace, it was preparation. Halver stood frozen, his fist still warm from contact, unsure if he'd won something or unleashed something he hadn't meant to wake. There was no satisfaction in his face now, no smirk, no twisted pride, only confusion, a faint, faltering question behind his eyes, like someone who just stepped onto what they thought was solid ground and felt it sink an inch too much. Regan, slowly, with the poise of something rehearsed far too many times, moved her right foot forward, just one step. Then she bent her knee and lifted her leg, placing her shoeplane, black, military in its silence, onto the seat of the chair beside her. Her hand reached down, undid the strap, and slipped the shoe off. The motion was intimate in its slowness, not delicate but deliberate, not ritual but restrained. She repeated the act with the other foot, revealing bare feet that touched the cold courtroom floor with a kind of reverence. Her balance never wavered. She didn't glance at the crowd, didn't look at the judge. Her eyes stayed locked on the man in front of her. She stepped forward again, barefoot now, the blood on her lip darkening as it dried, marking her chin like ink seals, a declaration. And when she spoke, her voice was so calm it cut sharper than any scream. "You don't know what you just touched." It wasn't bravado, it wasn't a threat, it was a statement, clean, final, and in its terrifying steadiness, it held the weight of a truth too vast for the room to contain. Halver blinked. He didn't answer. He didn't laugh. The courtroom seemed to lean back, collectively bracing for something it couldn't define, and in the space of one breath, Reagan moved. No wind-up, no scream, no shift in the shoulders to warn of what was coming, just a flash of movement too fast for instinct and too precise for chance. Her right foot left the floor and in one silent, devastating arc, connected with the side of Halver's left knee. The sound that followed was not a scream, it was not a thud, it was a snap pure and distinct, like a tree limb breaking in deep winter, like a bone that should have never been exposed to that angle, that force, that expertise. Halver collapsed without style, without resistance, his leg folding beneath him like a failed bridge. His mouth opened, but no words came, only the low, sick moan of disbelief and agony. The system had been hit, not insulted, not challenged, but shattered, in one motion. Reagan stepped back, not because she was afraid, but because the act was complete. She didn't hover over him, she didn't gloat. Her foot returned to the floor like it had only tapped a switch. And in many ways, it had. Behind them, someone gasped, a woman, older, seated 2 rows from the back, her hand rising to her lips as though trying to keep the sound inside. No one else moved, no one stood, no applause, no outcry, just stillness, the kind that only happens when something primal in the room has changed. The air didn't just shift, it recoiled. Halver writhed, his breath ragged, trying to gather himself, but the leg wouldn't respond. It had been unmade with clinical precision, the kind that doesn't come from rage, but from memory-body knowledge, the kind of soldiers have when they don't think, they react. But Reagan wasn't reacting. This wasn't retaliation, this was restraint lifting just enough to demonstrate a truth that had been long denied. The judge remained speechless. The gavel didn't fall. What would it declare? That order had been broken, that violence had stained the wood? The lie was too big now. There was no protocol for this. There was only reality, exposed and humming, raw as nerve. Reagan turned and walked back to her seat with bare feet against the polished floor, each step somehow louder than the next. She didn't look at Halver again. She didn't adjust her sleeves. Her silence said everything, echoed everything, answered everything. And the room? The room stayed frozen, not because a man had been brought to the ground, but because, for the first time, they saw who had been standing all along. The silence was no longer fragilite, was absolute. Not a silence that begged to be broken, but the kind that demanded stillness. It settled over the courtroom like ash after something ancient had burned. Halver lay on the floor, breath hitching, leg twisted beneath him, his expression a mess of confusion and disbelief. The system, so confident in its armor, had been struck by something it couldn't catalog, couldn't charge, couldn't explain. And Reagan? She had already turned away from him. Her job wasn't to punish. She had never raised her voice, never made a case. Her existence, composed and contained, had done all the speaking necessary. The courtroom hadn't moved. Not a juror, not a bailiff, not even the judge, until a man in a navy suit, eyes sharp behind rimless glasses, stood from the row behind the defense. His steps were measured, his briefcase clean as bone. He approached the judge's bench without request or hesitation, and what he placed before the court was not a folder, it was a declaration. The document was sealed in matte black, edges metallic, the emblem on its cover pressed deep in blood-red ink. Langley Protocols, black level clearance. The judge didn't reach for it at first. His hand hovered, uncertain, as if the paper itself radiated heat. When he finally touched it, his fingers twitched, not from surprise, but from memory some distant training, some forgotten directive, some quiet warning that now surfaced with teeth. The lawyer flipped open the cover. Inside was a single page, laser cut. At its center, a QR code, etched not in ink but with microscopic engraving, shimmered under the courtroom lights. A bailiff stepped forward instinctively, his phone already out, moving to scan the code. Then everything changed. As the scanner locked on and beeped once, just once the screen went dark for a beat, and then lit up with 5 words that fell like a gavel from space. Tactical asset, eyes only, level gray. The phone dropped slightly. The bailiff looked at the judge. The judge, pale now, looked at Reagan. She hadn't moved. The room, which had already been holding its breath, seemed to collapse inward again. This wasn't defense. This wasn't even a threat. This was infrastructure. This was government protocol. Not built for courtrooms, but for containment, for control, for war. The kind of clearance that superseded testimony, law, and most importantly, expectation. A second officer, younger, clearly rattled, began to move toward Reagan. His hand hovered near his belt, unsure of its purpose. Was it arrest, escort, or precaution? He took a single step. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He stopped, frowned, pulled it out. The message lit the screen with military font and no sender ID. Just 2 words in all caps, pulsing with finality. Stand down. A pause. Then a follow-up. Protected asset. The phone nearly slipped from his hand. The room felt unreal, like a set that had just realized it was being watched by something much larger. The judge, now visibly shaken, adjusted his collar, as if trying to anchor himself in ordinary function. He tried to speak, but no sound came out the first time. His lips moved once, then again. Reagan, in the center of it all, finally sat down. She did it with the same calm as one who has just returned from a walk. No tension in her shoulders, no fear in her gaze. She reached for her shoes, not hurriedly, not delicately. She slid each one on with care, like someone who had learned long ago that even small acts deserved attention. Then she adjusted the cuffs of her blouse, one, then the other, straightened them, aligned the seam. Her motions were small, domestic even, but in that moment, they were more commanding than any badge, any gavel, any oath in the room. Halver groaned from the floor, his voice rasping out of him like someone dragged through gravel. "What the hell are you?" he whispered. Not in accusation, not even in anger anymore. It was awe. It was fear, reframed as curiosity. It was the moment a man realizes he'd misjudged not just a person, but reality itself. Reagan didn't answer. She didn't need to. The courtroom had already begun answering for her. Because she was no longer just a woman in a chair, no longer just a defendant. She was designated. She was protocol. She was the reason someone somewhere had written the words "Do not engage" into a field manual meant for battlefields, not courthouses. And the message? The message had already been delivered. No words, no speech, just presence, and presence was enough. The image didn't just circulate, it detonated. It wasn't grainy security footage or shaky cell phone video. It was high definition, crystal clear, and framed like a war memorial. Reagan was seated, calm, unblinking, blood blooming on white fabric like a wound blooming across the flag. Halver falling, his face caught mid-collapse, his mouth open in a sound no one would ever care to hear again. CNN didn't cut away, they didn't mute the moment. They aired it in full, from punch to silence, from snap to shoe. The clip froze on her shirt, the red mark crisp against the sterile courtroom light. America saw it not through interpretation, but through transmission. This wasn't hearsay, this was a playback. Outside the courthouse, the message took form not in chants or broken glass, but ink on canvas. Protesters didn't scream, they stood, hundreds, holding signs that didn't beg for change but declared an acknowledgement already past due. One banner stretched above the steps read simply, "She didn't hit first, she hit back, perfectly." No corrections, no asterisks, just a fact. Within hours, hashtags lit up the web like signal flares. Number "She is the law" trended in 17 countries. Number "This is why we kneel" resurfaced, no longer a sports slogan, but a context reloaded with fire. Memes spread faster than press releases. One showed Reagan staring through Halver's fist like it were glass. Another compared her to a firewall, not a fighter, a limit. Opinion pieces surged, each more urgent than the last. Some called it justice, some called it a breach, but everyone called it something. A retired judge wrote in The Atlantic, "What we witnessed was not self-defense. It was systemic accountability issued by flesh and nerve." The quote was shared over 6 million times in 48 hours. Talk shows bristled with urgency. Pundits argued not over her action, but its implications. Was she military? Agency? Just a myth that showed up in the wrong courtroom at the right time? One white anchor with cropped hair and an anxious voice leaned into the camera and asked, what if she wasn't CIA? What if she were just a mother on the wrong end of a badge? The studio went quiet, not for drama, for realization. He leaned closer. What if she were your neighbor, a teacher, a citizen without protection? Then he paused, not out of breath, but out of assumptions. Would she still be alive? It wasn't rhetorical. It was raw. The kind of question that doesn't need an answer, it demands reflection. Comments flooded, in some, outraged, some inspired, all aware that the story had outgrown its borders. Reagan had said almost nothing, but the footage had spoken with unflinching clarity. Every pause in that video was a sermon. Every frame, a protest. The official statements arrived late and came thin. The department cited an ongoing investigation. The DA's office requested patience. The governor's office issued a brief 2-line acknowledgement of heightened public interest. No one used the word excessive, no one said abuse, but the people did. A single comment on a live-streamed panel discussion read, "It's not that she fought back, it's that she didn't flinch first." That's what scared them. By the end of the week, universities were teaching the case as media in motion. Law professors dissected it frame by frame, not for legality, but for subtext. Journalism students studied how virality replaced the press conference. And in a tucked-away part of D.C., an agency with no front entrance quietly adjusted protocol, they didn't update their files on Reagan. They simply made her file read-only. The playback looped again on the monitor. Halver's voice echoed from the chamber, guttural and jagged. He wasn't seated this time, he was caged, pacing inside a beige-walled interrogation room with no windows and no illusions left. His hair was no longer combed, his uniform stripped, replaced with gray-issued sweatpants and a pullover that hung like defeat. The camera above him didn't blink, didn't flinch. It caught every word, every stumble, every inch of sweat rolling down his temple like a confession still trying to hide inside a scream. "I didn't know who the hell she was," he barked. His voice bounced off the cinder block walls, searching for sympathy that wasn't coming. "I didn't see clearance. I didn't see the protocol. I saw a bitch sitting there, staring like she wanted me dead." Across from him sat 2 investigators. No jackets, no smiles. One took notes slowly. The other didn't even blink. They'd been doing this for years, officers unraveling their myths under fluorescent lighting. But this one was different. This wasn't a man explaining a mistake. This was a man explaining why he didn't think it was a mistake at all. "She was provoking me," Halver spat, slamming a fist into his open palm. "That look, that damn look. Who the hell does that in court? Just sits there with that face like I don't matter. Like I'm the one being judged. She wanted it, don't tell me she didn't want it." The note-taker didn't respond, just flipped the page. The second investigator leaned forward, calm, calculated. "Let me ask you something, Lieutenant," he said, voice smooth like a scalpel. "Do you think every white person who stares at you deserves to get punched in the face?" Silence. Not long. Just long enough for the lie to consider whether it could pass for truth. Halver snorted. "This isn't about race." The other investigator tapped his pen. "Isn't it?" He slid a tablet across the table. On it, a screenshot Halver, front and center, in a digital chat room, titled The Keepers. The caption above the image read, "Reclaiming order, restoring control." His username was circled in red. The messages were stacked beneath it, dated and logged, the language crisp, cold, unmistakable. One line was highlighted, "If I can't break them on the street, I'll break them in court." Halver's eyes narrowed. He leaned in, fists clenched. "That's private." "No," the note-taker said calmly. "That's discovery." Another swipe, another image. This time, a group chat. A message from Halver again. Time-stamped, no aliases. They're uppity in uniforms now. Think that makes them immune. Watch me fix that. The room felt colder now, not because of temperature, but exposure. Halver's bluster began to shake at the edges, like a wolf finding out the glass was one way. That wasn't meant like it sounds, he muttered. It's venting. That's how we talk when we blow off steam. Doesn't mean anything. The investigator didn't smile. You mean like your fist didn't mean anything when it connected with her face? The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of implication, of gravity, of systemic rot no longer hidden behind badges and procedure. It filled the room like smoke, too heavy to clear. In a separate chamber, Reagan watched the footage from a monitor. Her face was the same as it had been in court still, neutral, unreadable. She didn't frown, didn't blink rapidly, didn't reach for commentary. Her eyes remained fixed, not on Halver, but on the text scrolling beneath his image. Each word is a nail. Each timestamp exposes a wound. She sat alone, no attorney besides her, no handler, no escort, just a screen, a chair, and a silence so dense it felt like a weapon. Back in the interrogation room, Halver was unraveling. She's a threat. You don't get it. You weren't there. She looked at me like she'd already won. Who does that? Who looks at an officer like that? She made me feel like what? The investigator interrupted, voice flat. Like, your badge didn't mean power anymore? Halver stood, pacing now. You don't understand. We're the line. We're the ones who make people like her remember they don't run this. That courtroom was mine, not hers, mine. The note-taker paused, and yet she didn't have to say a word to take it from you. It was the quiet that did it, not the accusation, the implication that he had lost something, not just control, but identity, that his uniform no longer dictated reality, that for once, he wasn't the final authority, he was the example. Outside the interrogation room, reporters crowded digital platforms, dissecting every leak, every screenshot, every second of Halver's unraveling. Nobody cared about the punch anymore. That was yesterday's crime. Today was the unveiling, the slow strip-tease of hate dressed as policy, of fear masked as discipline. An anchor read aloud the latest headline. Lieutenant Halver linked to extremist group, The Keepers. A panelist asked, how many officers are part of this group, and how long have we ignored it? Another image flashed on screen. Halver standing beside a Back the Blue rally banner, flanked by two men who would later be identified as white nationalist organizers. The caption didn't editorialize. It didn't need to. Reagan continued watching. The monitor now played a new clip text messages extracted from Halver's department-issued phone. One read, today's the day. I'm not letting another one walk in and act like they own the place. No context, no code, just the raw, unfiltered mindset of a man who had believed for too long that the system was his playground, his pulpit, his arena. She didn't react. Her lack of response wasn't indifference, it was indictment. She didn't need to argue. The evidence was already louder than fury. And Halver? Halver had nothing left to say that wasn't already screaming from his own words. The footage didn't fat, it was dissected, frame by frame, angle by angle, velocity by velocity. A slow-motion montage broadcast across the country became the new national mirror. No voiceover, no background score, just the raw orchestration of cause, consequence, and something colder truth. The fist Halver sarsed from left to right like a gavel dropped by vengeance. Reagan's head turned with the blow, blood leaving her lips in a ribbon of red that caught the light mid-air, but her spine remained straight. Her eyes, even as her jaw twisted, did not blink. They tracked, they locked, they held. The frame stopped at the moment her gaze returned. Her face was stained, skin opened, and mouth quiet, but those eyes were more composed than any oath sworn in that room. And across the banner at the bottom of the national broadcast, scrolled the caption not written by editors, but fed by public consensus. She didn't fear him, he feared her. The networks weren't the only ones watching. AI software fed footage through military-grade behavioral analysis systems. Algorithms trained on decades of combat footage, hostage rescues, counterinsurgency reactions, special ops debriefs. The output came back in one brutal sentence. Subject Reagan demonstrates advanced tactical conditioning behavior consistent with elite field personnel, not civilian. And still, the video loop, the hit, the silence, the shift, and finally the break, not in her, in him. Newsrooms built segments around the physics. Biomechanical experts described the precise angle of her counterattack, her centered stance, the way she neither advanced nor retreated, but terminated the interaction with surgical certainty. She hadn't responded. She had resolved. One presenter, surrounded by analysts, froze the frame at the moment before her leg moved. "This," he said, pointing to her expression, "is not the face of defense. This is an interruption. This is a kill switch." Headlines poured in like rain through broken glass. Unarmed, unflinching, unmatched, military mind in civilian skin. What happened in that room wasn't a fight, it was an execution of control. Social media took a sharper turn. Split-screen comparisons flooded timelines. On one side, Halvera, white male, former SWAT, built like a command but posturing like chaos. On the other, Reagan, taller, leaner, quieter, no weapons, no rage, just eyes like they'd seen war and filed it. One viral tweet read, "He didn't hit a woman, he hit an equation he couldn't solve." A panel of legal scholars took it further. They played the clip and muted the sound. "Look," one said, pointing as Halver stepped forward. "This is a man enacting power, not law." Then she paused as Reagan rose. "And this is a system failing to anticipate consequences." The freeze frames became iconic. The punch, the blood, but it was the moment right after Reagan turning back, posture intact, eyes steady, that was printed on protest signs, murals, and one massive billboard erected in D.C. "This is what standing looks like." Students painted her eyes on locker doors. A tattoo parlor in Chicago reported 12 separate requests in one day for the shape of the scar at her lip, not for violence, but as memory. Meanwhile, quiet voices from within the justice system began asking the question that crackled like an electrical wire in floodwater. If Halver hadn't been stopped, what would he have done next? A female journalist, soft-spoken but sharp-eyed, posed the question on live television. Let's suppose her leg hadn't moved. Suppose she didn't know how to end it in one move. What would we be analyzing now? A funeral? A cover-up? Another muffled report with redacted lines and closed doors? No one answered. They didn't have to, because the system had already begun the slow, aching crawl toward acknowledgement, not of failure, not yet, but of exposure. And Reagan? Reagan hadn't posted, hadn't spoken, hadn't reacted. She didn't need to, because her face stained with blood, eyes steady as steel, had already said everything, and it would haunt them for years to come. It started like all good secrets, not with a bang, but with a leak. A single page slipped through encrypted channels, redacted lines still bleeding through black bars like bruises on a body long forgotten. The header read, "Langley Directive 17B, and beneath it, typed in cold bureaucratic clarity, "Deploy Spectre only in cases where internal structures pose systemic risk. No engagement without black-level clearance." The internet took it like fire to dry earth. Forums lit up. Security analysts scoured old briefings. Reddit threads exploded with timelines, theories, and cross-referenced intel. It wasn't just about Reagan anymore. It was about the thing she might be, thing no one was supposed to admit existed outside of rumor, training drills, or myth. Then came the confirmation. Not from officials, not from a press conference, from an interview aired in the dead space between midnight and dawn. A retired field operativino, name, no face, voice digitally masked, spoke from behind a black screen. "I served with the Gray Division in Bahrain, 2013, he said. Spectre wasn't a role, it was a last resort. You don't send Spectre in to solve a problem. You send them when the problem is inside the firewall." He paused. "They clean house. Quietly, permanently." The host leaned forward, as if the audience could feel tension through audio. "Have you ever seen one?" Another pause. Then, once, Yemen, 2 years after the bombing at Al-Qaeda. Naval intelligence was compromised. We didn't even know until it was too late. One asset dismantled the leak in under 40 hours. No bullets, no traces, just silence. She was tall, black boots, braided hair, never made eye contact except when she needed you to shut up. The audience didn't need the dots connected, they already had the image. And now they had a timestamp. Someone unearthed a grainy satellite still from the 2017 Yemen operation. Among scorched vehicles and wreckage was a figure, mid-stride, shoulder-angled, profile turned. The resolution wasn't perfect, but the comparison software didn't need to be perfect. The algorithm marked an 85% biometric match with Reagan. That should have been enough. It wasn't. The conspiracy moved faster than containment. Linguists broke down body posture. Analysts circled the boots. But it was a single photo from inside the courtroom, overlooked until now, that nailed the theory to the wall. A cuff. On the right sleeve of Reagan's blouse, barely visible beneath the rolled fabric, were 3 small metallic dots, silver, no wider than stitching. Not decorative, deliberate. Someone at Intel recognized the mark immediately. 3 dots, silver Arayan internal identifier, used only within the Gray division. Not for communication, not for glory, for tracking. So, assets could be confirmed from a distance. So, friendlies wouldn't pull triggers too late. The revelation didn't come from a press statement. It came from a viral post, captioned only, "They tried to handcuff the Gray division." No wonder the floor cracked. Within 24 hours, the post had been shared over 10 million times. Then came the editorial avalanche. An op-ed titled, "Spectre is real and we punched her in the mouth," went viral across every major outlet. It wasn't angry. It wasn't sympathetic. It was clinical. "You do not touch what was designed to be untouchable," the writer said. "We didn't just attack a woman. We struck the warning label, and the label responded." Podcasts followed. Whisper networks in foreign policy circles lit up. Questions no one had dared ask began threading through legitimate channels. What had she been doing in that courtroom? Was her presence planned? Had Langley placed her there, or worse? Had they lost track of her? Theories spiraled. None confirmed. All whispered. And Reagan? She hadn't spoken a word, which only made the silence louder. Because when the system starts shaking, it's not the names that matter, it's the silence between them. And Reagan's silence was now being treated like a signal, not noise, signal. The final nail came not from a spy or a journalist, but from a comment left anonymously on a classified military forum. It read, "Spectre doesn't appear when you want her to. She appears when the structure is already rotting. You don't activate her. The system triggers her like a reflex." And beneath it, just 3 words. Words no one wanted to read. She was triggered. The courtroom was not the same room it had once been. It no longer smelled like wood polish and stale authority. It vibrated now with an undercurrent of reckoning. Cameras were everywhere, but they weren't the main witness. That role belonged to the silence, alert, conscious, waiting for something bigger than verdicts or procedure. Reagan sat in the center of it, not defended, not accused. Present, exact. She hadn't spoken since the storm. She hadn't needed to, until now. She stood, not rushed, not timed, just a movement that made time itself adjust its pace. All eyes turned, but she didn't look at them. She looked at the judge, her voice calm and low but clear enough to cut marble. "I'm not filing charges," she said. "I'm requesting the unsealing of every document Halver's name has touched in suppression." It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't a theater. It was retrieval, a demand not for retribution, but reclamation. The judge blinked, unprepared. Unsealing on what grounds? Reagan's gaze didn't falter, because justice delayed is justice buried. Gasps? None. Not anymore. The room had moved beyond shock. It was in the terrain of truth now, jagged and sharp, where every word Reagan dropped landed like steel points on concrete. A file was handed to the bench. Internal emails, flagged and decrypted. The judge opened the packet. Inside lines of directives issued under Halver's command. Coded language. Brutal instruction. One line, highlighted in yellow, read, "Apply elevated force if eye contact exceeds 2 seconds. Disruption begins with the gaze." He read it twice. Then, a third time. Finally, "Lieutenant Halver, did you write this?" Across the aisle, Halver, pale and caged, barked a laugh that cracked under its weight. "She's a killer," he shouted. "She's not normal. You're all staring at a trained executioner and calling her a citizen." His voice cracked, but not from rage, from panic. "You don't understand. She's not like us. She's not playing by the rules. She's a goddamn ghost in the system. You think she's here for the truth? She's here to dismantle everything." Reagan turned her head toward him for the first time. No rush, no reaction, Then it came her first smile, small, tight, surgical, a smile like a blade pressed gently to a pulse. "I never said I was normal," she said. The room didn't breathe, because this wasn't about whether Halver was guilty. That had already been signed and sealed in the eyes of anyone with sense. This was about what came next. What else had he buried? Who else had been silenced under his command, their eye contact mistaken for a threat, their rights buried under the weight of policy masquerading as order? The smile faded. Reagan stepped closer to the bench. Her words landed with the weight of a new language written inside the old one. "I didn't come here to win. I came here to pull the veil." She looked at the judge. "If we don't unseal the past, we're not just excusing him, we're licensing the next one." The gallery sat frozen. Journalists didn't scribble, they recorded. One leaned to another and whispered, "She's not trying to win the court. She's auditing the court." And that was the difference. Halver wasn't just on trial anymore. The system was. Reagan returned to her seat. The courtroom didn't recover. It reloaded. The court lights dimmed not by intent, but by inevitability. The air had changed. The rules, too. It no longer felt like a trial. It felt like a reckoning in slow motion. And, as if summoned by the moment itself, a monitor flickered on without preamble. The clip played without introduction, without sound. It didn't need context. Everyone recognized the man in the frame. Halver. He was in a department meeting, not that long ago, casual dress, same bravado, speaking to a circle of nodding uniforms like he was preaching gospel. His voice came through cracked but clear. "We need to put them back in their place," he said, calm, calculated, saturated with contempt. "They've forgotten who we are. They look us in the eye now. That ends. You see one looking too long? You reset the balance." No one interrupted. The men around him didn't flinch. They nodded. The clip ended. Silence collapsed on the room like a falling cathedral. Reagan stood. She hadn't spoken yet. Her body rose with purpose but without performance. One hand pressed softly to the table as if anchoring the moment. Her other hand hung relaxed at her side, like it didn't need to hold anything to wield something heavier than weapons. She didn't look at the screen. She looked at him. Halver sat slouched now, smaller than he'd ever allowed himself to be. She took one step forward, and it was enough to shift every molecule in the room. Her voice was ice. "When you hit me," she said, "who did you think I was?" Not a whisper, not a shout, just truth stated, not asked. It wasn't a question looking for an answer. It was the answer itself. No one moved. No one could. The gallery was frozen, not in fear, but in realization. Not one person spoke. But then, one by one, they began to rise. Not cheers, no applause, not chants. Just bodies standing not in protest, not in allegiance, but in shared knowing. The kind of standing that happens when words become useless, when only posture can hold what must be held. The judge didn't gavel. The clerks didn't record. This moment would never live in a transcript, only memory. Halver looked around as if the walls had turned against him, as if the very architecture recognized betrayal. Reagan didn't blink. She didn't smile. She had no need, because in that moment, she was no longer a figure in a courtroom. She was the weight of every eye contact, mistaken for defiance. She was the mirror held up to power and returned unshattered. And, when she sat down again, the entire building seemed to exhale, but no one else did, because something bigger than justice had just entered the room, and it had her face. The silence that followed Reagan's final question didn't fat it, fermented. It thickened into something bitter, something ready to rot the pillars beneath every badge still clinging to borrowed honor. Because Halver, for all his arrogance, for all his brutality, for all his screaming, was never the real monster. He was just a part of the system, shameless enough to stop pretending. And now, with every eye in the nation fixed on a courtroom turned confession booth, Reagan moved again, not with rage, not with spectacle, but with precision. She didn't need a speech. She needed a file. The document she submitted was only 11 pages, thin, tidy, surgical, but it sliced like razors under fingernails. 3 names, 3 badges, 3 careers polished by decades of silence. Middle-ranking officers, not at the top, never at the top. but always close enough to smell the rot and turn their heads anyway. The report showed patterns, not in conjecture, but in digital ink. Each name had signed off on incident reviews involving Halver. Each one had marked inconclusive beside reports that were anything but. One had flagged a disciplinary case, then withdrew it within 48 hours. Another had edited body cam logs. The third, perhaps the most damning, had approved a tech policy allowing manual redaction of court surveillance footage before submission. The key word, buried in the digital trail, discretionary, footage delay. The judge's voice cracked when he read it aloud. Regan didn't flinch. She stepped forward again, not for drama, but to aim the next strike. This time, she didn't hand over documents. She handed over timestamps. 6 court cases, she said, her voice like polished steel, over the last 2 years, each involving Halver. All of them had gaps exactly 45 seconds missing from the courtroom cameras, always during cross-examination, always before the moment of force. The evidence spoke before she did. She pressed play. A recovered file from 2020 flickered to life. Faint grain, bad color correction, but the clarity was enough. A teenager, restrained in the back of a squad car, wrists cuffed. Halver at the driver's side door. No audio, just movement. The impact. The boy's head jerked against the window. Again. Then Halver looked up at the camera, smiled, reached up, touched the lens. The video froze. No one moved. Regan looked at the judge. That clip was buried. It took 3 subpoenas and a forensic archivist to recover it. They didn't delete it. They hid it under misfiled timestamps. Her words didn't rise. They sharpened. This isn't about me. It never was. The question is, how many others came before, and how many were recorded just long enough to disappear? Halver, silent now, looked away. Not ashamed, just caught. Caught in the only position he'd never prepared for, exposed without defense, abandoned by the very silence that made him brave. And Regan kept cutting. The punch wasn't the point, she said. The punch was rehearsal. He's been practicing for years. Then came the final blow, not with hands, not with footage, but with a sentence so cold it peeled the skin off the room's last illusions. No man that cruel survives without silent company. The crowd didn't react with outrage. It didn't have to. It responded with realization, because evil, real evil, never acts alone. It builds nests, and the system had been nesting him for years. The judge cleared his throat, but the words he wanted to say had no shape yet. The law wasn't ready, but the truth was already out. Regan stepped back, and every file she had opened stayed open, because this wasn't a cleanup. This was an excavation, and there was still more to dig. The courtroom had not yet recovered from the quiet detonation Regan delivered in her previous appearance. The scent of consequence still lingered in the polished wood and in the stiff collars of those who used to lean comfortably into power. And now, the man who had thrown the first punch, not just of violence, but of legacy, was being granted his curtain call. Halver walked in with the gait of a man who no longer knew what posture to assume. Gone were the squared shoulders, the cocky grin, the weaponized swagger that once silenced entire rooms. He looked smaller, not in stature but in consequence, as if the very gravity of his failures had started folding him inward. The gallery watched, breath held, but not for sympathy, only for the spectacle of what justice, even when unspoken, looked like in motion. He approached the podium, hesitated. His eyes flicked toward Regan, who sat still, her profile like a coin pressed from marble, unmoved and immune. Halver clutched the edge of the podium, as if words required scaffolding. Then he began. I never meant for it to go that far, he started, the tremor in his voice more practiced than sincere. I was doing my job. I was following protocol. I didn't know who she was. A murmur passed through the audience, not outrage, not agreement, but a low tide of disillusionment. Halver pressed on. I saw someone staring me down, someone daring me to lose control. And oh, snap, but I'm only human, a servant of the law, caught in a moment. He paused to produce a tissue, dabbing at dry eyes. Theatrics, poorly timed. The judge said nothing. The court reporter typed, and Regan had yet to move. I didn't know who she was, he repeated, leaning on that phrase like it might absolve the past. Then Reagan stood. No rustling accompanied her movement, no dramatic score, just the sound of one woman rising steadily, completely, as if the weight of silence had finally shifted to allow it. She walked forward, each step measured and calm, like time itself had folded to let her pass untouched. Halver froze. Her presence had not changed, but the context had. The courtroom, the city, the nation, they now understood something that no uniform, badge, or authority had ever taught them. Fear does not come from violence. It comes from unwavering stillness. Reagan reached the desk. She didn't look at him. Instead, she reached to the collar of her shirt and unhooked a small steel-gray card tucked against the seam, as if it had always been silent, waiting, final. She placed it gently on the wood before him. No flourish, no stare, just contact. The camera didn't zoom in. It didn't have to. Those in the room leaned forward instinctively, and those watching on the screens felt the weight of something inevitable. Halver looked down. The card said, "You don't need to know my name. Just remember how you felt when I stood before you and didn't bow." That was all. Nothing else. No department seal, no clearance level, no insignia, because none of those things ever mattered. Halver's mouth opened slightly, as if trying to summon a rebuttal, but the air betrayed him. Words withered before they could become sound. He closed his mouth, and in that moment, his silence was louder than any of Reagan's. She turned and walked away, not hurried, not hesitant, just done. Like her part in this theater was over, and whatever was left now belonged to those who still believed in scripts. No applause followed, no cheers, just that rarest of sounds in a courtroom full of eyes, complete, reverent silence. Because she hadn't shouted, she hadn't explained, she hadn't declared war, or love, or vindication. She had simply stood, she had simply acted, and that act alone dismantled more than testimony ever could. Halver, still seated, stared at the card as if it were made of glass and gilt. His fingers hovered over it, but didn't touch. He knew better now. Or maybe he just feared what would happen if he tried to possess what never belonged to him. One by one, the observers began to exit, not because it was over, but because nothing else needed to be said. The judge never asked for further remarks. The stenographer closed her laptop. Even the security guard at the door shifted back a step, unsure if protocol included guarding a room that had just witnessed judgment without a sentence. Outside, the reporters waited, mics trembling in their hands. But Reagan didn't stop. She didn't break stride. And when they called her name, she didn't turn around. Because that, too, would have given him something he didn't deserve. She wasn't a symbol. She wasn't an avenger. She wasn't a shadow of government bureaucracy cloaked in myth. She was the consequence. And consequences don't speak. They arrive. They alter the air. And they leave. What lingers is yours to carry. She wasn't a symbol. She wasn't an avenger. She wasn't a shadow of government bureaucracy cloaked in myth. She was the consequence. And consequences don't speak. They arrive, they alter the air, and they leave. What lingers was theirs to carry, and yet not everyone was willing to carry it. The morning the federal misconduct probe was officially announced, the marble steps of the Capitol trembled under the weight of a new kind of reckoning. No flags were lowered, no statements released, just a cold, curt bulletin stamped by the Office of Federal Oversight, commencement of inquiry into judicial civil rights violations, case reference 813, D, active review in progress. No names, no mentions, but everyone knew. Inside the chamber designated for the closed-door briefing, the tension was metallic, not sharp, but grinding like machinery, forced to operate under new rules. Members of the Independent Oversight Committee sat aligned behind polished tables, flanked by analysts, observers, and two silent agents from the Department of Internal Ethics. Reagan didn't speak. She didn't need to. The weight she carried entered the room before she did. She walked forward with a plain black case. No logos, no identifiers. It clicked softly as it opened, and the contents were revealed not in spectacle, but in precision. A solid-state drive encased in matte steel, engraved only with the word Veritas. She placed it on the table, slid it forward, and stepped back. No preamble, no context, just that. The lead analyst, a woman in her 40s with a reputation for shredding classified briefings before lunch, reached for the device and nodded toward the adjacent screen. A moment later, The first video played. Timestamp, the 12th of August, 2022. Location, County Precinct Holding Bay. The screen showed Halver pacing like a warden in his kingdom. Off camera, a voice stammered. Then the frame caught Halver turning to someone behind the camera and sneering. They laughed. Others off-screen joined. The sound curdled like spoiled milk in a steel cup. Regan's face did not move. The next clip loaded, and the next, and the next. 137 clips, some blurred, some with audio distorted, cut mid-sentence. Some so brief they were just flashes of hands, uniforms, threats muffled by closed doors. But every one of them bore the same fingerprint. Missing segments, altered metadata, overwritten dispatch logs. A pattern not of accident, but of orchestration. The analysts said little. They only took notes. Outside, the media speculated. Headlines ricocheted. Dark justice files surface in federal probe. 137 eyes into a system that pretended it saw nothing. But Regan made no statements. The footage was statement enough. 2 days later, a private hearing was disrupted not by protesters, but by a single line leaked from internal transcripts. A sitting conservative congressman had reportedly said, in frustration, "We're letting a trained killer dictate how we interpret law." The leak burned across the airwaves. Social media split into two, one side calling Regan a necessary firewall, the other branding her a threat to due process. But no one could unsee the files. When the hearing reopened, the room had changed. This time Regan didn't bring any drives. She didn't need to. She entered as before, silent, surgical, precise. A man stood to object Senator Malkin, known for his love of procedural order and disdain for personal vendettas disguised as reform. He pointed a rigid finger at her. "We are being strong-armed by someone who used to operate in the shadows. You're not the law. You're a relic of a battlefield. This isn't a covert op. This is democracy." Regan didn't blink, but her voice, when it came, was colder than any winter briefing room she'd ever stepped into. "No," she said, turning to him with the calm of someone dissecting rot. "You've let a monster define justice for far too long. I'm not redefining the law. I'm just making you look at it." No applause, just the shuffle of paper being gripped tightly. The committee chair, a woman who had long championed court reform but never expected to become its battlefield, cleared her throat and addressed the room. "This isn't about who she is," she said. "It's about what we ignored when we knew better." And the clips those silent witnesses kept playing, room by room, office by office. One sequence in particular drew silence across 3 agencies. A clip, buried in a folder marked Personal Training, HAL 104, showed Halver instructing a younger officer. His voice was low, but distinct. "If they look at you longer than 2 seconds, use force. They're casing you. Treat them like threats." No one spoke for a full minute. No one needed to. Regan stood once more, not to speak but to exit. Her part was never to prosecute, only to present. The door clicked shut behind her like a verdict. Outside, the narrative fractured further. Protesters carried signs not for Regan, but for the names in the footage unknown victims, their bruises once invisible, now undeniable. One sign simply read, "I was video, 42. Another, "She didn't show the system. She proved it, hid itself." And in underground channels, law schools and criminal justice courses began dissecting not her file, but the mechanisms she exposed. A leaked syllabus from one university carried the course title, "Modern Civilian Resistance and Evidence-Based Justice. Case Study." Regan. She never saw it, because by then, Regan was already gone. Her job had never been to remain. It had been ignited, and what burns now is not her legacy, but their denial. The hearings were far from over. More names would be named. More video files would crawl out from the darkness. But one truth, unassailable, remained. She had not asked for justice. She had returned its receipt. Stamped in time, burned into record, filed under public memory, permanent record. She had returned its receipt, stamped in time, burned into record, filed under public memory, permanent record. But systems, like old wounds, rarely heal without dragging out the rot beneath. The next rupture didn't come from Reagan's hand, it came from a byline. A Pulitzer-nominated investigative journalist, known for cracking military cover-ups, dropped a piece that detonated across every federal inbox by sunrise. The strategist in white. Inside Reagan's role in Operation Dawnfold. The article unfolded like a slow, incision-precise, unflinching, surgical. It revealed that Reagan had not simply served. She had advised. That she wasn't just deployed, she was consulted. And that her silence had never been compliance, it was containment. Operation Dawnfold had long been whispered about in the deepest corners of the Pentagon, an internal sweep of suspected traitors embedded within the Department of Defense, tied to both foreign operatives and domestic militias. No shots fired. No explosions, just one strategic breach in the human chain of loyalty caused an entire counter-network to disintegrate from within. The leaked excerpt from the internal operation log read, Subject RE 226 recommended linguistic pressure on Unit 17, resulting in unconditional surrender without kinetic engagement. No casualties. Target belief systems are disarmed via semantic conflict redirection. Translation, she talked them down. A full military unit, armed, trained, turned to submission not by bullets, but by blueprint. It wasn't the kind of story that ignited Twitter hashtags. It ignited silence. Deep, unsettled silence in offices where clearance was a currency. Because if she could do that there, what had she done here? The next hearing was electric before it even began. Halver was already seated when Reagan walked in, his mouth drawn taut, his pride corroded but not extinguished. His eyes followed her like a man trying to understand the trigger of the bomb that had already gone off in his life. The chairwoman acknowledged the new documents submitted to the inquiry panel and motioned for an update to the official record. Reagan said nothing. The file was stamped. But Halver, cornered by reputation, gnawed at by irrelevances now. He stood abruptly, unprompted, eyes flashing with something rabid. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, spit flecking the air. "I am an American citizen. I have served. I have upheld the law. Who is she to stand here with no accountability? Who is she to challenge everything we've built?" The room stilled. Reagan didn't flinch. He jabbed a finger toward her, the way he used to jab suspects in back alleys when no cameras watched. "She's not elected. She's not confirmed. She's not even supposed to exist. Who the hell is she?" Then her first smile in days. Not warm, not mocking, just surgical. She stepped forward, not to take the mic, but just to be heard. "I'm the reason you haven't been dismantled from within," she said, voice clean as glass. "I'm the firewall you didn't know you needed. And yet, when given a choice, you aimed your rage at the shield, not the fire." A silence pressed against the walls. Halver stood frozen, somewhere between fury and collapse. His ego hadn't calculated a counterstrike made of facts. Then came the second leak, this time, audio. A voice identified as a retired CIA handler, speaking to a classified oversight panel, confirmed. Reagan only moves when the internal mechanics of a system show zero capacity for course correction. She doesn't strike out, she strikes back when the rot becomes operational. The sound clip spread across secure channels faster than news ever could. Congressional aides whispered. Think tanks revised white papers. Law schools rewrote their ethics modules. No one had seen this coming, because they had never prepared for a threat that came not with muscle, but with meaning. A prominent political commentator, normally flippant and unbothered, tweeted the phrase that became graffiti across barricades and faculty lounges alike: "She doesn't use force. She makes force irrelevant." In private backrooms, those once convinced of Reagan's danger now feared something deeper, not her skills, but the question she raised. What if the system she challenged was never built to survive a mirror? Halver's allies in the committee tried to redirect. One senator accused Reagan of abusing intelligence assets for personal motives. Another claimed she was sent to incite distrust in domestic institutions. But every accusation stumbled against the same wall. She had made no move of her own, only turned over the evidence. And the evidence, as always, was louder than rhetoric. One of the most damning files surfaced next to briefing Reagan had co-authored for an internal joint counterintelligence review. It concluded, psychological leverage is most effective when deployed by agents who've already survived the failure of the systems they serve. Their truth is uncoachable. It was time-stamped 3 years before the courtroom assault. She had predicted them. And now, by merely existing, She was their echo. Back inside the hearing, Halver had deflated, not from fatigue, from erosion, because there are kinds of defeats that don't break bones, they bankrupt purpose. He looked across the table at her and saw not a woman, not a witness, but an equation he could no longer solve. He muttered under his breath, "They think she's a savior. She's just a weapon in heels." Regan didn't respond, but a legal observer beside her did. Softly, "She didn't come armed. You did. She just came prepared." The panel adjourned for the day. As Regan exited, a reporter in the hall called after her, not by name, but with a question that stuck to the walls like fresh paint. "Are you still working for them?" She stopped but didn't turn, only offered 4 words before walking away. "Ask yourself who them is," and that was enough, because in a world where the loudest voices often tell the worst lies, she had built her legacy out of whispered truths, out of strategy, not spectacle, out of silence, not submission. And now, whether they wanted it or not, the system was being redesigned not by vote, not by decree, but by the irreversible consequence of having seen her, not with weapons, but with words sharpened sharper than steel. And no one-note Halver, not his enablers, not the ghosts of systems past could unsee her anymore. Not with weapons, but with words sharpened sharper than steel. And no one and not Halver, not his enablers, not the ghosts of systems past could unsee her anymore. The letter arrived with no seal, just a line of type centered in the middle of the page, cold and undeniable. Request for public testimony, oversight hearing, National Ethics and Accountability Forum. There was no threat, no ultimatum, just history finally asking to be addressed, not in private hearings or redacted transcripts, but in the open, where legacy lives or dies under the weight of collective memory. And Regan answered. No guards flanked her, no advisors whispered at her side. She entered the Capitol rotunda alone, wearing a suit so white it refracted every flashbulb into silence. The fabric didn't shimmer, it absorbed. She moved without stagecraft, without declaration, and still, the room quieted as if someone had just struck a bell none of them could hear. She stood before the committee, not in protest, not in plea, but in posture, a presence that made the polished floor feel more like a courtroom, and the senators more like students. The chair recognized her, not by title, but by name. Regan nodded once, then spoke. Her voice was steady, as if pulled from deep within a page not yet turned. Not everyone deserves an apology. A pause, but everyone deserves to remember exactly what happened. That was it. No more words, no call to arms, no dramatic confession, just a line, so sharp it didn't cute it etched. Outside, the crowd was already assembled, not chanting, not shouting, just standing. Tens of thousands. They stood in streets, on courthouse steps, on balconies, and rooftops. They didn't move, they didn't cheer, they didn't riot. They became walls of eyes, of presence, of refusal to forget, a quiet war formation of memory. And somewhere in that stillness, a little girl held up a handmade sign, its crayon letters wobbly but unmistakable. If they can hit her, they can hit me. That was all. No date, no name, just truth, wrapped in cardboard and held by hands still too small to vote. Inside the chamber, silence weighed more than rhetoric. One congressman leaned in, preparing a rebuttal, but stopped. There was nothing to refute. There was no loophole in the gravity of what had just been said. The floor adjourned, not with gavel strikes but with breath withheld. Regan turned, stepped down, and exited the chamber like someone leaving behind a page she knew they'd all have to reread eventually. Journalists tried to catch her outside, but no microphones dared interrupt what had now become an atmosphere. She didn't address the cameras. She didn't clarify her statement. She didn't need to. The moment had already fossilized into history. Later, a historian would write in a footnote buried deep in an academic journal, "When Regan said those words, she didn't accuse, she achieved." Elsewhere, a retired justice would whisper to a mentee, "She didn't raise her voice, she raised the floor." And in living rooms, classrooms, and city halls, her sentence was replayed not for drama, but for calibration, because in a time of hyperbole, she had chosen precision. In a culture of spectacle, she had chosen consequence. That day, no one burned a flag, but flags were lowered in private, not out of disgrace, but out of recognition that something had shifted, not loudly, not overnight, but permanently. Laws would still be passed, cases would still be heard, but now every chamber echoed faintly with a memory that a woman in white had once stood there and reminded them that silence is not peace, and remembering is not weakness. It was the kind of moment that doesn't ask for attention, it demands reflection, and history finally was listening. But the past rarely surrenders without dragging someone to their knees. The announcement came with no press conference, just a one-line directive posted quietly by the Office of Public Accountability. Subject: Lieutenant Jonathan Halver. Action: full revocation of pension, benefits, and service designation. The words were clean, surgical, no adjectives, no ceremony, because when decay is exposed, its removal is not punishment, it is hygiene. And so the hearing was scheduled, not for trial, for reckoning. The chamber was fuller than it had ever been. No special guests, no cameras allowed, just the weight of finality hovering over every polished seat and every unspoken breath. They had all come to witness a kind of silence that rarely occurred in politics, a silence with no agenda, no applause, no outcome to manipulate. Halver was brought in without cuffs, but that only made it worse. His suit no longer fit, not because of weight, but because dignity had left his frame, leaving the fabric to sag and hang like a costume on a stage too solemn for actors. He walked with a limp now, not from the physical injury it had long healed, but from the blow to his permanence, the knowledge that no badge, no oath, no affiliation could shield him from a truth made public. He reached the center of the chamber. The floor beneath him gleamed, waxed like history should be, unforgiving like memory tends to be. He looked around. Not a single nod met him, not a single familiar face to offer the illusion of belonging. Then he turned. Reagan sat in the second row, not in the spotlight, not behind glass, just present, as she always was. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, not understanding, not forgiveness, just a measurement of what had been done, of what could never be undone. And then, without prompt, without protocol, he dropped. A single knee to the ground, no grand motion, no performance, just surrender. But no one moved, no gasp, no camera shutter, no sympathetic shift in posture. The silence wasn't confusion, it was a calculation. And Reagan, she did not flinch, she did not nod, she did not rise to meet it. She simply turned her head slowly, deliberately, as if to say, "The page has already turned, and I will not reread you." Then, and only then, came the sentence, soft, but not fragile, clear, but not loud. "I don't need your apology. Apologize to those who died with no camera watching." The words dropped like stones in a well that had never reached bottom. No echo returned, just absorption. Halver remained on one knee, as if waiting for absolution that would never arrive, as if still misunderstanding the weight of a moment he no longer controlled. And still, no one spoke, not from the bench, not from the gallery, not from the committee, because everyone, even those who had once defended him, knew this was not penance, this was theater after the audience had already left. Reagan stood only once, not in response, but in the finality. She walked past him like he was smoke, not to insult, not to humiliate, but because sometimes the greatest dismissal is to treat a man not as a monster, but as irrelevant. No one followed her out, and when the heavy doors shut behind her, it was not with drama, it was with finality. Later, transcripts would record the event in one line. Subject: Halver knelt. Witness: Reagan responded. Session adjourned. No footnotes, no applause, no redemption. Because there are moments where justice does not sound like a gavel, it sounds like no one needing to say a damn thing. That day the chamber didn't echo, it absorbed, and it remembered. But memory, when stirred too long, becomes more than remembrance, it becomes interrogation. 3 days after Halver's silent descent into irrelevance, a classified memorandum leaked not through the usual hacks or anonymous forums, but through a single, deliberate breach. No logo, no signature, just a header. Operational Review. Subject R-226. Conduct under Protocol 9. It was addressed to the National Security Council. The contents were brief. Agent Reagan acted within authorized engagement parameters. Protocol 9 was initiated to preserve system integrity through exposure of internal threat structures. Her non-disclosure is in alignment with Section 4.17 Covert Ethics Directive. Further civilian escalation was projected if internal containment failed, the reaction inside the Hill was nuclear. Some whispered the phrase civilian escalation like it was an indictment. Others clung to system integrity like it was a lifeline. But none could ignore what it meant. Reagan had not just responded. She had executed a sanctioned strategy. At the next press briefing, the White House press secretary stood in front of the nation's cameras, blinking against the heat of questions fired like rounds. A reporter from the Boston Herald asked it first. Was she planted to take down the police system? The press secretary dodged. A second reporter sharpened the point. Did the CIA use a courtroom to dismantle local law enforcement from the inside? Then came the strike. A veteran journalist, weary but unblinking, asked what no one else would: was the courtroom ever safe from itself? Hours later, in an off-the-record session, Reagan was asked the same question directly, not in front of microphones, not for the public, but behind closed doors, by a man who still believed the system could swallow its shame without choking. He leaned forward, elbows on polished wood, voice coiled with resentment disguised as curiosity. Did you set them up? Reagan didn't smile. She didn't blink. She just exhaled. Number. They set the trap. I just didn't step around it. The room didn't shift. It shrank. That line rippled out like sonar. And suddenly, the focus wasn't on who Reagan was, but why someone like her had become necessary at all. Military analysts released an unclassified breakdown of Reagan's physical reaction during the courtroom assault: heart rate, breath control, and stance. Everything pointed to high-level combat conditioning. The conclusion: response consistent with elite-tiered defensive engagement. Operational reflexes suggest conditioning beyond the civilian threshold. The phrase "beyond civilian threshold" struck a nerve. A thread began to unravel, not about her, but about them, about us. Why would a citizen need to be trained like that? Why would a courtroom become a battlefield? Why did the law require armor just to walk through its doors? Those questions didn't trend. They infected. High school debate teams added new topics. Resolved that, in a just society, no civilian should require military-grade instincts to survive a legal proceeding. A satirical cartoon in a Sunday paper showed a child in body armor raising her hand in class. "May I object, Your Honor?" But it wasn't satire. Not really. Because Reagan wasn't a specter of overreach. She was a symptom of retreat, a reflection of how far the structure had drifted from its mission, that only a figure forged in threat could now illuminate the rot. And the country didn't know whether to thank her or fear what she implied. Commentators on both sides stumbled over how to name her. Not a hero, not rogue, not an agent, because none of those names explained the deeper unease. That unease was this: she didn't make herself necessary. The system did. And when systems create their antagonists, the question isn't how to eliminate them. It's how to survive their reflection. A think tank released a white paper titled "Defense or Design: The Rise of Civilian Combat Readiness in Government Spaces." The opening line read, "When the temple of justice requires warriors at its doors, it ceases to be a temple." And so Reagan's name became less important. It wasn't who she was, it was what her presence demanded we ask. Who built the walls that made her necessary? Who let the rot grow so long that only fire could expose it? And what kind of country looks at a woman trained to survive war and makes her fight for peace? There were no answers, only echoes. And Reagan, as always, did not chase them. She let them chase themselves. She let them chase themselves. But even reflections, when held long enough, become records. The invitation came wrapped in bureaucracy, but carried the weight of confession. The title was Sterile National Conference on the Future of American Justice, yet everyone knew why they had asked her. Not for solutions, for proof. And Reagan, as ever, did not arrive to be honored. She arrived to be understood. The stage was austere. No banners, no teleprompters, just a long table, a single microphone, and 8 photographs stacked beside it. Each photo was black and white, unframed, printed plainly, names handwritten on the backs in pen. Reagan didn't open with thanks. She didn't adjust the mic. She didn't nod to the attendees. She placed the 8 photos face down on the podium, then raised her eyes. "I brought their faces because no one else did." Her voice was low, not subdued, contained. "This is Martin, hit in the stomach so hard that his spleen ruptured. It never made it to a file." She flipped the first photo. This is Tasha. Her jaw was broken in 3 places. The officer called it a restraint technique. Flip. This is Javier. They said he fell. His spine says otherwise. One by one, the faces stared back, not at her, at the system that forgot them. And then came the line that wasn't written in any program. I am the last one who lived, and if necessary, I will be the final witness to their silence. The audience did not move. They didn't even breathe. Her statement was barely 4 minutes long. No charts, no policy proposals, just faces, and her refusal to let them be erased. She ended without a bow, without a plea, without a slogan, but by the end of the day, the world had already spoken for her. Clips of her speech swept across every major network, overtaking even presidential campaign coverage. One caption read, "The quiet that spoke louder than power." A quote from her closing line went viral. She didn't fight for herself. She fought so others wouldn't have to. And for once, there was no partisan war over its meaning, only a reckoning with why that statement had to exist in the first place. Editorials across ideological lines converged on the same unease, that a woman with no political party, no public mandate, no hunger for power, had just redrawn the map of what it meant to stand for justice, not through confrontation, but through the collection of memory, of harm, of truth. And suddenly, the debate was no longer about whether Reagan had gone too far. It was about how many others had never gotten far enough. Law schools added her testimony to their ethics curricula, not as case law, as context. A mural appeared overnight in Chicago, her outline surrounded by faceless silhouettes, captioned in spray paint, "Speak if you survive, remember if you don't." She never asked for it, but she didn't need to, because some people don't need monuments. They leave trails, and Reagan's trail wasn't made of applause. It was made of name Sichuan, a note in a ledger the nation had stopped pretending wasn't real. That day, she walked off stage with no escort, and yet the room stayed standing, not for her, for the 8th. The hall had emptied long before the weight of her final sentence settled, not because they didn't understand, but because they did. Those who remained lingered out of obligation, not defiance note takers, interns, aides with recording devices that hummed softly like an echo chamber refusing to shut down. Outside, the plaza looked unchanged pigeons circling statues, tourists unaware that something foundational had just been dislodged, but inside, the silence crackled. Reagan had not raised her voice. She hadn't needed to. Her cadence was spare, each phrase like a scalpel. She didn't accuse. She annotated. Her testimony wasn't emotional. It was evidentiary. Yet the tremor it caused reached further than any outcry could have. Behind the two-way glass, a consultant leaned back, muttered under his breath, "We can't patch this over." And he was right, because what was exposed wasn't a flaw, it was a habit. The first fracture came less than 48 hours later. A headline in a regional paper described a former sheriff seen at a gas station, muttering obscenities at the pump while reporters circled at a distance. It wasn't the words that spread, it was the expression caught on a passerby's phone, the look of a man who realized that for the first time in 3 decades, his voice no longer carried consequence. The video surged across platforms not for spectacle, but for symbolism. Comments piled up. "That's the face of a power outage." He had once called Reagan's concerns fiction spun by feeling. Now, even the town council that had shielded him voted to remove his portrait from the municipal wall. A janitor took it down during his night shift and replaced it with a printout, a single sentence from Reagan's closing statement, bolded and centered. "We inherited this system, yes, but we're responsible for its upkeep." Then came the school incident. A history teacher, still clinging to the old narratives, told a class of 9th graders that what happened to Reagan was an unfortunate misunderstanding amplified by social media. He chuckled after saying it, but he didn't laugh long, because a student raised her hand, not to speak, but to project. She mirrored her phone to the classroom screen and played the original footage. Reagan, calm but firm, reading aloud the full record of procedural violations that had been redacted from public view. The class fell silent. The teacher tried to interrupt. She pressed pause. "This was never about misunderstanding," she said. "It was about someone finally refusing to be gaslit on record." That clip, too, traveled. By evening, the school board had received over 3,000 emails, and the teacher was placed on administrative leave. No statement followed. Just a calendar update. Curriculum review scheduled. Monday, 9 a.m. Elsewhere, in the city's southern district, a corporate panel on ethical leadership featured none other than Jonathan Halver himself, billed as a resilient strategist. His speech began with a smile, a tailored anecdote about weathering storms with grace. But midway through, an audience member stood up, mid-level HR manager, early 30s, dressed plainly, and read aloud the exact paragraph from the tribunal documents where Halver had dismissed Reagan's warning as narrative manipulation by subordinate sentimentality. She didn't raise her voice. She just kept reading. Even when the mic was cut, even when security edged forward, the room didn't erupt. It just sat, frozen, as Halver's hands curled at the edge of the podium. He didn't finish his speech. He didn't return for the second panel. And by the end of the week, his consultancy website was down, his LinkedIn scrubbed, no press release. Just a void where certainty once lived. But the most brutal inversion came in a place no one expected: Sunday service. In a congregation Halver used to frequent, his former pastor had given a sermon titled Mercy Without Memory. It was vague enough to slide by most, but sharp enough to sting those who knew. He spoke of the danger of overcorrection, of allowing emotion to redefine truth. He didn't name her, but he didn't need to. That afternoon, 3 elders resigned. One left a note on the pulpit: "We serve the gospel, not revisionist nostalgia." The next week, a replacement speaker was invited, an unassuming woman in gray slacks who opened with no scripture, only a story. It was about a system that broke, and the woman who documented it before it collapsed. She never said the name Reagan. She didn't have to. The sanctuary was full. No one clapped, but no one left. Across these moments, the shift didn't look like fire. It looked like erosion. Reputations that once seemed invincible weathered down, not by force, but by exposure. The old guards lost more than position, they lost narrative. And where their names used to crown documents, now they existed only as qualifiers, as lessons in margins, as anecdotes in the ethics briefings no one used to read but now cited like scripture. Halver, once praised for his unflinching clarity, became a subheader in silence. He wasn't hunted, he wasn't punished, he was reclassified. And as newer recruits entered the service, they didn't learn his name through plaques or speeches. They encountered it only once, in a training slide projected on a screen inside a gray-walled classroom under flickering lights. The image was clinicalno photograph, just his title, his rank, and a label. Under Module 6, Systemic Breach and Ethical Collapse, a section read, Case Study, Jonathan Halver, The Anatomy of Authority Without Accountability. Below it, a footnote, Example of consequence emerging externally due to internal failure to self-correct. It didn't begin with her face on a screen. It began with an unsigned memo slipped under a door at 2:14 a.m., time-stamped but not watermarked, carrying only one line: all systems run until something refuses. That something had not been loud or new. It had worn regulation boots and filed reports in triplicate. It had passed every psychological evaluation and saluted at every checkpoint. It had spoken carefully, methodically, in meetings full of echo and pretense. It had raised objections, not flags. But when it broke rank, the fracture didn't appear where they expected at the edge. It split straight through the middle. And when it did, no one knew what to do with the silence that followed, because it didn't sound like a protest. It sounded like precision. The first reaction came not from within, but from a broadcaster too fast with headlines and too slow with nuance. She labeled Reagan a disruptor cloaked in compliance, aired a segment featuring grainy footage out of context, and implied that her actions were emotionally motivated rather than tactically justified. By nightfall, viewers had unearthed a clip from that same broadcaster 4 years earlier, praising a male officer for doing less under riskier circumstances. The side-by-side comparison flooded comment threads with captions like, "Discipline for him, defiance for her." The station's PR team stated by morning, calling the edit an unfortunate oversight, but the host didn't return the following week. Her name trended for 3 days, not in tribute, but in correction. The second shift came in uniformed form. Captain Drew Kessler, who had publicly questioned Reagan's credibility during the inquiry, had once mocked her data obsession as bureaucratic paralysis dressed up in moral panic. He smirked when he said it, seated under an agency seal that now seemed a size too large for the room. but someone retrieved the deleted training roster spoof. Kessler had skipped 2 mandatory sessions on systemic bias and falsified his signature on the post-module compliance form. The image of his forged initials, circled in red and posted anonymously to a whistleblower page, spread with speed. Within 48 hours, his administrative leave was no longer temporary. By the end of the month, he'd taken a job at a private security firm whose own homepage omitted his last name. His portrait was quietly removed from the academy wall. A janitor later admitted he hadn't been told to take it down, he just didn't feel right leaving it there anymore. A third break surfaced not in headlines, but in homework. At Easton Technical High, a student's research project titled Command versus Consequence used Reagan's timeline as a case study. The teacher, wary, gave it a B- and scribbled too emotionally slanted in the margins. The student scanned the paper, posted it with side-by-side citations from official documents, and added the caption, "When truth earns a B, the rubric needs revision." The post caught fire. A former DOJ advisor reshared it, calling it the most cogent summary of procedural collapse I've read in years. Within days, the school district issued a statement promising curricular realignment. The teacher declined to comment, but later left a review for a textbook she once assigned, writing, "Outdated framework, needs deeper interrogation of complicity." Her name wasn't tagged, but she wasn't missed. The last rupture came in a ceremony. A retirement gala for one of the senior intelligence directors drew over 200 guests, officials, donors, strategists, all gathered under chandeliers and careful laughter. Midway through the evening, a projector began displaying a slideshow of career highlights. The third slide glitched, then froze on a headline, "Reagan files formal objection to Protocol 7. The crowd fell silent. It wasn't the headline that stunned, it was the caption beneath, a quote from the director himself. "If we silence every alarm, we can't be surprised when the fire reaches the archives." Someone had pulled it from a confidential briefing transcript, verified by the timestamp in the corner. No one claimed responsibility for the slide. No one needed to. The next morning, an internal audit was launched, the gala budget suspended pending review, and the director's final address, once scheduled for press distribution, was shelved indefinitely. Through it all, Reagan never spoke. Not in interviews, not in op-eds, not even in response to the whisper campaigns that tried to reframe her as uncooperative. Her silence wasn't a retreat, it was architecture. While the noise outside surged, panels, statements, edits, denials, she returned to a space not built for show, a room without windows but lined with processors. Her badge still scanned, her desk still held the same pen, cap, and undisturbed. The project hadn't paused in her absence. It had waited. There were no banners, no new protocols named in her honor. But in a code rewrite embedded deep within the system's audit software, a new string had been inserted: Reagan, verify, cross, reference all flagged redactions with original field logs. No signature, just process. And while systems recalibrated and panels reshuffled, a small school auditorium in Milwaukee unveiled a new plaque. It bore no agency seal, no donor branding. Just 4 words etched in bronze above the stage: Miles Hall of Accountability. The students didn't know who Miles was, not precisely, but they were assigned a recurring essay, part of the new civic literacy module. Its prompt changed slightly each year, but the last sentence remained constant. When does silence serve justice, and when does it erase it? This year, a sophomore 16, wiry, quiet, turned in his paper early. His teacher, moved by the precision of his final line, posted it online. Within hours, it was shared by authors, judges, and a sitting senator. The line read, "We are not afraid of justice. We're afraid of calling power by the wrong name." No one could reach Reagan for comment, because no one knew where she was, and somehow that made more sense than if they had. She didn't need to be seen. She had already been understood. There was no statue, no street, but there was a shift away. People stood straighter when entering courtrooms, a pause in officers' hands before reaching for authority, a question now asked by first-year law students before any others: is this power, or is this justice? And somewhere, in a conversation between 2 strangers who would never meet again, someone might say, "Remember that woman in white?" And the answer might come softly, "Yeah." She didn't speak to be heard. She spoke to stop others from being silenced. In that, the story had no hero, only gravity, no finale, only residue. And for a brief, unforgettable sliver in time, Justice didn't wear a robe. She wore quietly, and it was louder than any verdict ever read aloud. But history, when it dares to speak plainly, often leaves behind questions it refuses to answer. In a quiet, windowless room buried beneath the Justice Department's headquarters, a closed-door session took place that wasn't on any public calendar. No press, no transcripts, just 7 officials from varying levels of federal oversight gathered for what the agenda simply called Reagan Dossier Final Review. The air inside was colder than necessary, though no one mentioned it. Fluorescent lights buzzed above, flickering occasionally, as if the building itself was uneasy with what might be said. They had gathered not to celebrate, not even to condemn, but to reckon with something none of them fully understood, but all of them felt the weight of. Outside that room, the nation had already moved on, at least on the surface. News cycles had returned to their rituals, midterm polls, foreign policy stumbles, a senator's extramarital scandal. But beneath the chatter, fragments of what had happened still glowed hot in places no pollster could reach. In New Jersey, a county courthouse received a package with no return address inside, only a CD containing footage of Halver dragging a teenager from a hallway and slamming him into a wall, time-stamped and dated 5 years prior, a case long closed as a non-compliant suspect, officer exonerated. The footage spread before the court clerk could finish her lunch. A week later, protesters showed up outside that courthousenaut shouting, just playing the clip on loop from projectors against the outer wall as jurors walked by, heads down. In Baton Rouge, someone hacked a patrol cruiser's dashboard camera feed and streamed a single clip on public access television, Halver laughing in the back of a precinct room, joking that if you gripped the back of the neck hard enough, they stopped moving altogether. The officer beside him had laughed too. He resigned that afternoon. In Oregon, a high school civics teacher put Reagan's image next to Rosa Parks on a PowerPoint slide. A parent complained. The school board voted to ban the comparison. The next morning, students flooded the hallway with homemade posters that said nothing but one word in red block letters. Again, the district had to close for 2 days. In Atlanta, a small church replaced its stained glass panel of St. Michael with a figure not named, cloaked, hands lowered, surrounded by 8 shadows. The plaque beneath simply read, "When memory stands up." Back in that sterile government chamber, the files sat unopened for a while. No one reached for the folder. No one touched the printed transcripts or reviewed the videos cued on the monitor. They had all read them already. They had all seen enough. What remained was not data. It was the question, a question too big for procedure, too complex for legislation. The youngest of them, a woman from internal ethics, who had only joined 6 months ago, stared at the wall as if the answer might imprint itself into the concrete. She had grown up believing in the balance of systems, that mechanisms could fail, but the architecture would hold. But something in her had changed the moment she saw Reagan walk past the cameras without speaking. Not the silence itself, but how the silence rearranged the room. How every man in a suit suddenly sat straighter, as if gravity had shifted. Not because of her presence, but because of what it reflected. On the table sat a photograph of Halver, one from years ago, grinning, arms folded across his badge, the kind of pose used for recruitment brochures. Someone had drawn an X over his name in blue ink. No one admitted doing it. No one erased it either. The man from National Security, hair graying, suit too tight from years of power enjoyed without interruption, finally leaned forward, fingers steepled as if prayer could extract what truth would not say aloud. He had written the language for expanded wiretap provisions. He had once testified that justice needed to be armored, not softened. But today, his voice was different, not uncertain, just honest. Were we manipulated by a CIA asset? The silence that followed wasn't indecision. It was restraint. Finally, a woman from the ethics division responded, her tone sharp but devoid of venom. We were reflected. By everything we thought was beyond questioning. Nobody contested it, because there was nothing to contest. The room sat still, not in consensus, but in exposure. No vote was taken, no action proposed, just acknowledgement that sometimes the most brutal consequence of corruption isn't a scandal, it's recognition. Outside those walls, the world didn't need meetings to feel what had shifted. In a small city, 3 states away, a police training facility held its regular morning drills. The sun was still low, shadows long and silent, but there was weight in the air that had not been there the week before. Not wind, not cloud, but memory. It was the kind of memory that didn't arrive through headlines or hashtags. It arrived through changes in posture, hesitation before routine, and the sudden awareness that not all things could be undone with protocol. Across the country, things had begun to fray quietly for the ones who had built their careers on unspoken immunity. One former precinct captain found his name etched into a public bench, not to honor him, but as a warning. Someone had carved the words he erased footage into the grain beneath the slats. It trended for an afternoon, not because it was surprising, but because the city council refused to remove the bench. Another officer, once known for training younger recruits in assertive restraint, was caught on video trying to enter a grocery store only to be turned away by the manager, who calmly said, "We reserve the right to deny service to those who forgot what service means." The footage was just 23 seconds long. It went viral in under 2 hours. In a courtroom in Pennsylvania, a defense lawyer opened a case by requesting that the arresting officer be identified not by badge number, but by disciplinary record. The judge denied it, but the audience in the gallery stood up. 12 people, quietly, without signs or chants, just presence. The trial halted. The judge recessed. No one spoke to the press. The press didn't need to ask. In a coffee shop outside Phoenix, a man in uniform approached the counter. The barista, no older than 19, placed a cup on the counter without taking his order. On it, in thick black marker, were 3 words: "No one forgot." He left the cup there. She didn't pick it back up, and behind her, another employee stood beside the espresso machine, not saying a word but wearing a patch sewn into the sleeve of her apron. It wasn't part of the uniform. It simply read, "Justice does not flinch." Meanwhile, the quiet spaces absorbed it all. There were no press releases, no revised legislation, but something had curled inside the system's architecture, a soft retraction, a new awareness in how voices carried through halls that had once been engineered to only echo in one direction. No agency claimed responsibility, no politician took credit, but people noticed things. The security guard at a courthouse in Kansas City no longer demanded that people remove their hoodies before entry. The principal of a high school in Birmingham added a section to the curriculum called Ethical Silence and Moral Weight. No tests, just reflection. On the other side of that still morning, at the police training facility, the whistle hadn't blown yet. The drill sergeant was standing 10 paces away, clipboard lowered, eyes on the group like someone searching for something he could no longer name. The line of cadets hadn't shifted, but there was something different in the stillness. It wasn't fear, it wasn't defiance, it was readiness, but not the kind drilled through repetition. It was a readiness that had absorbed everything the world had whispered over the last few months. A readiness that came from understanding you may one day be asked to answer for silence you didn't create, but didn't challenge either. The youngest among them stood at the end of the line, her gaze fixed straight ahead, but her shoulders more relaxed than the rest, as though she had already understood that the work wasn't about strength. It was about choosing when to let strength speak and when to let it wait. A small breeze passed through the field, catching the edge of a training mat nearby, lifting it just enough to reveal a scuffed line written in chalk beneath it. The words had been half erased, not by erasure, but by repetition. No one said them aloud. They didn't need to. In one of the open fields, a group of cadets stood waiting, boots aligned, shoulders tight. Among them was a young woman, not the top of her class, not the most outspoken, but her record had been flawless, quiet, consistent, unshaken. An instructor, clipboard in hand, walked by, paused, and asked casually, "You got a thought on the Reagan case?" She didn't answer. She just pulled on a pair of worn training gloves, adjusting the wrist strap like a ritual she didn't need to explain. As she stepped into the sparring circle, her undershirt lifted just slightly, just enough for the others to glimpse what had been written by hand across the inside hem. Not again. That morning had begun like any other. Concrete, cool underfoot. Whistles slicing the morning stillness. Cadets standing in rows, carved by years of repetition. But nothing about this particular morning was ordinary in the spaces between formality. They all knew what had shifted, even if no one was assigned to name it. The drills continued, but the questions lingered, unspoken but fully present, settling in the creases of their uniforms and the heaviness of every paused breath. Outside the training grounds, 4 incidents had caught national attention in just under 2 weeks each, one more damning than the last. In Ohio, an officer had been spotted pushing over a memorial candlelight vigil, muttering about media-hyped martyrs. A bystander caught it on video. The footage looped for days. The department stated regret, but not an apology. Protesters didn't block traffic. They just stood at that corner for 48 hours straight, holding the candles he had kicked. In Florida, a sheriff publicly dismissed the Reagan hearings as a well-choreographed act by some D.C. ghost and laughed during a televised panel. Less than 24 hours later, someone mailed him a copy of the Langley clearance order, circled in red, with the phrase, "Spectre Doctrine," eyes only underlined. The image leaked. His office issued a clarification. The laughter stopped. In Northern California, a retired captain who had defended Halver online insisting the woman escalated it walked into a diner and was met with silence. The manager refused to serve him, not with words, just with a receipt handed across the counter. The printed line beneath the subtotal read, "The woman stood. You sat." He left, and the footage was never shared. But someone framed that receipt. It still hangs behind the register. In Boston, an off-duty officer had made the mistake of calling Reagan a PR stunt in boots at a bar. A woman across the room, elderly, small, rose from her stool and placed a copy of the Constitution in front of him without saying a word. When he shoved it aside, the bartender refused him service. The woman returned to her drink. The story spread without video. Some things didn't need footage. They had witnesses. Back on the training field, the instructor didn't press for an answer. He knew better. The circle cleared. Gloves tightened. One of the cadets whispered something beneath his breath, words meant for sarcasm. Not a statement, but the silence that followed crushed it midair. It wasn't that she demanded attention. It was that the room no longer knew how to ignore what she represented. She moved into stance slowly, purposefully, like someone remembering every step of a path others had forgotten to walk carefully. Her opponent hesitated, not because of skill but because of weight. There was something in the way her feet touched ground, something in the stillness behind her eyes. Not anger, not pride, precision. As she ducked into position, her shirt shifted barely, but it was enough. A glimpse, a flicker just under the seam where fabric met purpose. The faint scrawl of ink, jagged from motion, still visible despite the sweat. Just enough for the others to glimpse what had been written by hand across the inside hem. Not again. The letters weren't bold. They weren't stylized. They looked like they'd been drawn quickly, maybe in a locker, maybe on a day she didn't want to forget. The message wasn't defiance, it was preparation, and that was enough. Because legacy doesn't always wear uniforms. Sometimes it wears restraint. The headlines had long since shifted to newer outrages, different scandals, fresher noise. But for those who had heard her speak, who had seen her stand without armor, something remained etched, not in policy, but in posture. They didn't build statues of Reagan, they built protocols. The first sign of change didn't come from a senator or a court ruling, but from the revised training syllabus quietly distributed to all field agents in the Midwest region, where one line now read, "The subject's silence is not a gap, it is a calculated presence." No one cited her name, but everyone understood who it referenced. That same week, an internal affairs director in Louisiana resigned abruptly after a leak exposed that he had signed off on 6 suppression requests targeting footage from body cams, all from incidents involving the same precinct. One of those videos surfaced nonetheless, a young black man being slammed face first into a curb while asking to see a warrant. The officer, visible, shouted, "Stop resisting." The man's arms never moved. The sound of his cheekbone cracking echoed louder than the words. Within hours, students at a nearby university taped mirrors to the exterior windows of the police station facing inward. No protests, just reflections. In Detroit, a precinct commander previously praised for his efficient suppression of unrest found his face on a mural downtown, rendered not in admiration but in ash. The artist had burned the image onto reclaimed wood, then wrote across the top in spray paint, "Efficiency isn't justice, it's camouflage." When asked for comment, the commander called it vandalism. 2 weeks later, he was reassigned without explanation. In Oregon, a retired judge gave a lecture at a local law school where a student stood during the Q&A and asked whether the system was designed to evolve or merely to defend itself. When the judge began a familiar speech about checks and balances, the student placed a printed still frame of Reagan's hearing on the table in front of her, standing alone, palms resting flat against the oak. She wasn't speaking, but neither were they. The judge paused, then said, "Next question." Meanwhile, in Tennessee, a town council held a vote to rename a street that had long borne the title Justice Way. They renamed it Interrogation Avenue after discovering that every officer stationed at the bordering station had faced credible misconduct allegations, none of which led to terminations. The mayor called the renaming performative, the residents called it accurate. Outside the same building, someone spray-painted 3 words across the pavement in quiet red letters. "She stood here." No one painted over it. There were other shifts, less visible, more embedded. A new onboarding document for federal courtroom marshals included a section on ethical passivity, the moments when doing nothing becomes an institutional endorsement. A municipal HR department in North Carolina required department heads to complete a scenario simulation titled, "When Justice is Present, but Protocols Fail." The final slide showed no video, no reenactment, just the transcript of a woman saying, "I didn't speak to be heard. I stood so others wouldn't have to." It paused for 20 seconds before advancing, and across those quiet rooms and fluorescent corridors, the presence she left behind never asked for reverence. It asked for recalibration. What they feared most was not her knowledge, it was her clarity. The fact that she never raised her voice, never needed volume to disarm an entire architecture of posture and deference. She never shouted, but the echoes of her restraint carried through doors long thought sealed. It wasn't just the law that shifted, it was language. In memos, phrases like command presence were quietly removed. In procedure documents, terms like non-compliant posture were flagged for review. In courtrooms, more judges began pausing, after testimonies, not to think, but to listen, not to rebut, but to recognize. And still, she did not return. No interviews, no memoir, just absence, sharpened into permanence. The kind that doesn't ask to be remembered but makes forgetting feel like a compromise. Cadets now stood straighter, not to impress, but because they knew someone once had, and it had cost her more than reputation. It had cost her anonymity, and in return, she demanded nothing. She only made them notice. Notice the pause before power moves. Notice the silence that is not compliance. Notice the question embedded in every command. Who does this protect? They didn't build statues of Reagan. They built protocols. They didn't name buildings after her. They adjusted blueprints, not with grand gestures or commemorative plaques, but with the silent revisions that only insiders notice. The shift in tone during onboarding sessions, the new slide added to the ethics module, the footnote in a leadership memo cautioning against uninformed escalation in high-visibility situations. They didn't lower flags or declare Memorial Days. Instead, they reworded policy clauses, inserted cross-references, and mandated oversight in departments that previously operated like private kingdoms. Her name was not trending, but her case was embedded in footnotes, in examples shared during risk assessments, in the rhetorical questions whispered between mentors and mentees in hallways. One of the first dominoes to fall had been the annual gala at the city's elite Kluben event, where the deputy commissioner, drenched in entitlement and aged scotch, had once toasted decisive leadership with a wink that excluded half the room. That year, the gala was canceled last minute, with no explanation. Whispers said it had something to do with a leaked video and off-the-record conversation where the same commissioner referred to her as a calculated liability in a pretty suit. The clip surfaced not through the media but as a file link silently forwarded across interagency emails, accompanied by no subject line, no commentary. Just the weight of context. 3 weeks later, his letter of retirement bore the kind of cold phrasing that screamed internal coercion. For reasons aligned with my evolving balancing personal priorities. Another name gone from the plaque outside HQ. Another space quietly reclaimed. Meanwhile, on a morning that smelled of stale coffee and PR panic, a state-level task force met in a closed chamber to discuss optics. No cameras, no transcripts. Just 12 men and women around a table pretending the air didn't taste like consequences. One of them, a public affairs director with a reputation for twisting narratives into folk tales, proposed they reframe the sequence of events to highlight collective institutional growth. But the room went silent when the junior member woman, 2 years out of law school, tapped the table and said, without flinching, "You mean lie." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. No one replied. By the end of the week, she was reassigned to a lower-profile unit, her desk relocated to a windowless corner with no nameplate. Months later, her quiet refusal would resurface as a bullet point in a litigation timeline the moment the state's case started unraveling under its spin. In a separate echo of unraveling, the local university, which had once invited the primary instigator of the case to give a keynote on integrity and governance, found itself drenched in student protests after an anonymous archive was published online. The archive, sourced from private group chats and voice memos, captured him mocking the woman's silence in the aftermath of her public cross-examination. In one clip, he laughed and called it the best use of restraint since duct tape was invented. The students didn't riot. They didn't break windows or burn flags. They built a digital replica of the courtroom in a virtual campus space and hosted nightly replays of the transcript, each line read aloud by rotating volunteers. Attendance hit thousands. The university revoked his honorary degree in a single-line email. He resigned before the semester's end, citing creative differences with the student body. But the most unexpected fracture occurred in a suburban church, far from microphones or algorithms. The pastor, a longtime friend of the woman's accuser, had used his pulpit to caution against modern martyrdoms built on misinterpretations. His Sunday sermon, once a sleepy affair of folded hands and polite nods, became a battlefield the morning he claimed that forgiveness requires admission, but so does justice. A woman in the fourth pew stood mid-sermon, held up a photo of the transcripts projected on her tablet, and asked, voice calm, eyes locked, which part was misinterpreted. The congregation froze. The pastor stammered. No one applauded. But by the next Sunday, half the congregation had switched to a neighboring chapel. Donations dropped 72% in 1 month. The sign outside the church, once boasting scripture, now reads only, "Closed for structural reassessment." There was no film, no biography deal, no ribbon-cutting ceremony with cameras flashing and hands awkwardly gripping oversized scissors, but the software used by the public service training academies began running quiet simulations using a new protocol, dubbed informally by coders as Procedure A11. A nod no one explained, but everyone understood. In coffee shops and break rooms and debriefing lounges, instructors began with the same line, "Let's talk about what happens when someone doesn't fold." And across the city, someone quietly paid for copies of the full transcript to be printed and sent to every public defender's office in the state. No return address, no message, just a sticky note on the first page. Know what they're capable of when no one's looking. She didn't become folklore. There were no statues, no songs, no viral TikToks with solemn music and blurry images, but doors that had once closed with practiced indifference began to hesitate. Eyes that once rolled with arrogance began to blink in calculation. And when, inevitably, someone asked months later, in a boardroom or a classroom, or maybe even at a kitchen table, did all of that happen? The first change wasn't loud. It was procedural. A memo with no header passed hand to hand like contraband in a precinct hallway that still smelled faintly of bleach and fear. They called it the Reagan Clause behind closed doors, though no one dared name her aloud in official settings. It wasn't policy, not yet, but it lived in the back of every revised incident report, in the caution behind every commander's narrowed eyes, in the tightened jaw of a supervisor reviewing footage twice instead of once. Her presence, or what was left of it, had become subdermal under the skin of the system, not breaking the surface, but pulsing. The first time they tried to erase her under disciplinary noncompliance, they underestimated the gravity of silence. The server crash wasn't a hack. It was a refusal. An entire internal network went dark. For 3 days after her name was flagged for deletion, no explanation followed. just a single log entry, restored from a backup by someone who signed only with the word "still." From that moment, Reagan's existence was no longer a matter of record-keeping, it was a matter of collective memory. They tried to ridicule her. Publicly, a former commissioner went on a live-streamed panel and called her a product of internet hysteria and post-fact outrage, smirking as if the weight of a system could still prop him up. The footage went viral for the wrong reasons, not his words, but the moment a co-panelist, a decorated veteran and former federal analyst, slowly took off her earpiece, stood up, and walked out without saying a word. The silence cracked louder than any rebuttal. Within 24 hours, that clip had more shares than the commissioner's entire career. He was scheduled to appear on a late-night segment the following week, but the network pulled the invitation without comment. Days later, a chalk message appeared outside his home, written in sharp block letters across the sidewalk. It wasn't hysteria, it was her spine. The second rupture came during a leadership retreat at a quiet hotel nestled between cedar woods and comfortable lies. The event was meant to be off-record, insulated from scrutiny, where senior officers could speak freely under the illusion of privacy. One of them, Lieutenant Acker, known for his casual disdain, offered a joke over whiskey, mocking how Reagan had probably tripped over her boots trying to act brave. It wasn't the words. It was the timing. Because someone had already installed a directional mic beneath the catering table, and by nightfall, the clip had reached a whistleblower blog managed by former enforcement personnel. The backlash wasn't performative, it was surgical. Acker was forced to resign not by protest but by ostracism. Even his alumni association issued a statement severing ties, citing discrepancies in conduct and honor. His name vanished from the academy wall within a week, unceremoniously replaced by a bronze plate left intentionally blank. But the third incident didn't involve footage or quotes. It involved a child. A 7th-grade student in a public civics class asked her teacher why certain cases weren't included in the textbook. The teacher fumbled. The class grew still. The girl pulled out a printed article, folded carefully like something sacred, and laid it on her desk. It was Reagan's photograph, not smiling, not posed, just standing stubborn, unbent, in the middle of a storm she did not start but refused to abandon. That photo had not been archived by the mainstream press. It had lived on a single community server curated by volunteers, updated manually each week. Yet somehow, the girl had found it, and in the days that followed, parents began requesting copies. By the end of the month, the district received formal requests to revise its curriculum, citing omissions of contemporary precedent. The board tried to stall, but the state's legal counsel issued a warning. Silence in the face of a pattern could be interpreted as complicity. The textbook company pulled 3 editions from the shelves, quietly, without press releases, but the footnotes grew teeth. Still, the most searing moment came in a parking garage in Philadelphia a month before winter. A Menonce, a division chief, once the one who signed off on the action that led to Reagan's forced suspension, was approached by 2 strangers in tailored coats. They didn't threaten, they didn't speak. One simply handed him an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single line from Reagan's initial deposition. Power is not what they let you have. It's what they expect you not to use. That same week, his nomination to a national board was pulled. No explanation, no scandal, just absence. By Friday, his nameplate outside his former office was missing, and his assistant, who had once giggled when Reagan's badge was revoked, was reassigned to archiving cold cases in a windowless basement file room. No statue bore her face, no foundation claimed her name, yet policies changed, budgets were redirected. Complaint reviews that once vanished into the administrative abyss began showing up in oversight dockets, attached to timestamps and flagged emails. The shift was not dramatic. It was deliberate, not a movement, not a rebellion, but a rebalancing. Supervisors found themselves hesitating before issuing orders they used to bark without consequence. Officers began reviewing their footage before internal affairs could. Mid-level commanders started printing out their memos, not for bureaucracy, but to leave a paper trail they could stand behind if necessary. Recruits didn't know her full story. They weren't taught it in blocks, but they carried something unspoken, an extra pause before escalation, a glance before a decision, the understanding that power untested is not the same as power unaccounted, and across lockers, radios, handbooks, her name traveled not as lore but as weather a pressure system shifting without a center but unmistakably felt, because some legacies are not carried in honor. They are carried in instinct. The answer didn't come with proof. It came with instinct, a glance, a silence. And somewhere, a young officer is tightening her gloves, because Reagan was never a story. She was a shift, and in the end, she wasn't a lesson. She was the warning.